Hello there, and welcome back to another quiet, cozy chapter of boring history for sleep. If you're here for a soft, thoughtful journey through the weirder corners of human history, then you're in the right place. Tonight's tale might just make you raise an eyebrow, or two. Before we begin, take a moment to slow down. Dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and maybe let a fan or soft sound play in the background. If you haven't already, feel free to tap that like button or subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these strange and sleepy stories. And if you're up for it, leave a comment below to share where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always lovely to see this little community stretch from midnight kitchens to early morning bedrooms all around the world. Now let's talk about a topic that's usually whispered, giggled about, or swept under the historical rug: intimacy in medieval times. What was it really like? Was it all chivalry and candlelight, or something much more awkward, earthy, and improvised? Let's find out. You find yourself in a one-room cottage, the kind that smells faintly of old straw, smoked turnips, and wet wool. The hearth crackles with a low fire, not because it's cold, though it often is, but because smoke keeps the fleas and flies at bay. You've laid out your hay-stuffed blanket, tucked between two half-snoozing children and one very opinionated chicken who seems to have claimed a corner of the bedding as her own. Somewhere near your head a goat stirs and lets out a grumbly little sigh. Welcome to bedtime. Medieval style. Privacy, at least as you understand it, now simply didn't exist. There are no doors here, only heavy curtains drawn across makeshift beams. Walls are made of wattle and daub thin as a whisper, and cold air seeps in through every seam. Families don't sleep apart. They sleep together, huddled in heaps for warmth and safety. If you're lucky, there's a wooden partition to separate humans from livestock. If not, well, you've got hooves near your toes, and snouts near your face. And still, somehow, you're supposed to fall asleep. Or maybe, share a quiet, stolen moment with the one you love. This is where medieval intimacy begins. Not with candlelight or violins, but with coordination compromise and a very strong sense of timing. Now let's be clear, medieval people weren't emotionless automatons. They longed, they flirted, they found each other under haylofts and grapevines. But for the vast majority, especially among the peasantry, any kind of romantic physicality had to happen while sharing a single sleeping space with children, elders, and sometimes apprentices. Even among the upper classes, where stone walls and feather beds were more common, privacy was an illusion. Servants entered and exited without warning. Attendants prepared clothes at sunrise and doused the fire at night. You had a better chance at secrecy in a monastery than in a noble house. One 14th century pastoral record from England noted somewhat dryly that a man's sin was oft made public, not by his mouth, but by his mother's ear, for she did share the very wall. It sounds humorous, and it is, but it speaks to a larger truth. In medieval daily life, the walls didn't just have ears. They had eyes, mouths, and opinions, too. So how did people navigate it? Carefully, strategically, and often with great improvisation. Waiting until children were asleep, or at least pretending to be. Choosing the farthest straw-padded corner, whispering, moving slowly, trying not to wake the dog whose growl could alert everyone. There are folk tales, usually comic, of couples slipping out to the barn for fresh air, only to return red-faced and smelling suspiciously of hay. You might chuckle, but in the absence of bedrooms, these were some of the only places where two people could be alone. And then there was the church. Ah, yes, the ever-watchful institution that hovered over every domestic detail. According to historian Ruth Mazo Karras, the medieval church was deeply invested in sexual behavior, not just as a moral matter, but as a social tool. Control the bedroom and you shape the soul. In sermons, manuals, and confessional guides, priests were encouraged to ask about acts behind closed curtains. Intimacy wasn't just private, it was a religious responsibility. Which raises a question: if the church discouraged passion, the house lacked privacy, and the goat wouldn't stop bleeding. How did people ever manage to keep romance alive? That's where human ingenuity came in. One quirky detail from a 15th century German village record notes that newlywed couples were sometimes given small tents or cloaks that they could drape around themselves inside the house, creating a kind of movable bedroom. Think of it like the medieval version of a do not disturb sign, only made of linen and a whole lot of whispered prayers. It's amusing, yes, but it speaks to a persistent human need to connect to love, even when the world is watching. Some scholars suggest that this constant lack of privacy may have shaped emotional intimacy differently than in modern times. Without space to express affection physically, people may have relied more on coded gestures, passing a piece of bread a certain way, pausing a glance longer than necessary, offering an extra scoop of stew during dinner. These were the love languages of those who couldn't touch without consequence. And yet there were moments, stories from medieval ballads and plays hint at barn dances that turned into twilight embraces, harvest festivals that blurred lines under the stars, a young man taking his beloved's hand behind the abbey wall just out of view. These small rebellions, fleeting as they were, suggest that affection found a way always, even if it had to be quiet, even if it had to share a bed with 3 siblings and a goat. Still, it's important not to romanticize. There were deep imbalances of power, particularly when it came to gender and class. A wealthy lord could command a maid's attention in ways that were neither mutual nor safe. A widow might be denied her rights if no male relative supported her claim. Passion existed, yes, but so did danger, hierarchy, and control. This is why, even in the most practical peasant households, the act of getting close was never just personal. It was social, spiritual, political. It could secure a legacy, or spark a scandal. It could produce joy, or judgment. And every creak of a straw mattress was both an invitation and a risk. So you lay there in your corner of the hay with your partner beside you, and half the household within arm's reach. You listen to the wind tickling the thatch roof. You feel the slow warmth of another body. You hear the shift of a sleeping child, or maybe 2. You wonder if now's the time. And just as your hand brushes theirs beneath the wool, the chicken squawks. Intimacy medieval style. But maybe that interruption isn't such a bad thing. After all, the rhythms of life in the Middle Ages were not built around personal preference. They followed the seasons, the land, the church bells, and the needs of the entire household. Even affection had to fit between chores and obligations. Morning began at sunrise, sometimes even earlier, with livestock to feed, bread to knead, and water to haul. The idea of carving out personal time for emotional connection, let alone romance, was almost laughably modern. And yet, it still happened. In some villages, young couples developed silent signals, tiny unspoken rituals to slip past watching eyes. A scarf tied a certain way, a walk timed, so 2 paths accidentally met behind the mill. In Icelandic sagas, even hardened warriors carved runes of longing into wooden beams and stone walls. Messages no one would notice unless they knew how to look. A blacksmith's apprentice might pause his hammer just long enough to make eye contact across the thatched courtyard. A baker's daughter might leave one loaf a little warmer, a little sweeter, and hand it across the stall with trembling fingers. It wasn't poetry, but it was real. And all of this, the tension, the planning, the restraint, wasn't just born from logistics. It was shaped by power. Because while 2 people might long for each other across the straw-strewn floor, not all longing was equal. Gender and class shaped the boundaries of every relationship. For peasant women, especially unmarried ones, intimacy outside of wedlock could destroy their social standing, or worse, their livelihood. A pregnancy without a husband meant being cast out, fined, or losing access to family support. For men, the consequences were often less severe, unless a scandal became public, or interfered with property claims. Even so, in tightly knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business, and reputations stuck. Still, couples tried, and sometimes they succeeded. You can almost picture it, the careful tiptoe across a creaking floorboard, the whispered laugh muffled behind a hand, the hurried breath, as someone listens for footsteps beyond the curtain. Even in the smallest, most crowded homes, there were slivers of time late at night, after the last ember fades, when the world pauses just long enough for two souls to reach each other. One curious entry from a 15th century Welsh household record notes a lover's bench built into the side of a hearth, a narrow seat just big enough for two people to sit closely, shoulder to shoulder, hidden in shadow. It was described as a place of quiet warmth. And though no one wrote exactly what happened there, the tone is unmistakable. It's a reminder that even within hard lives, small spaces of softness were carved, sometimes literally. Historians still debate whether the average medieval couple felt emotionally close in the way modern couples expect. Letters and wills suggest that some did. A 14th century husband writing from prison begged his wife not to remarry too quickly, telling her, "I miss your voice more than bread." Another man left his wife not just property, but a note saying, "You are the best of my days and the mother of my laughter." These moments, rare as they are, hint that connection wasn't just physical. It was tender, too. Of course, that tenderness had to compete with fatigue. After a long day of field work, hauling buckets, mending clothes, and dodging fleas, not everyone felt up to affection. According to some church records, married couples confessed to sleeping apart out of sheer exhaustion. Even passion, it seems, needed rest. But maybe the beauty lies in the effort, in the way medieval people reached across barriers, not just physical ones like shared rooms or cold weather, but emotional ones shaped by rules, roles, and rigid expectations. They navigated love and desire in a world where privacy was a luxury and timing was everything. And still they carved out quiet corners of connection behind barns beneath stars, and sometimes beside a very grumpy goat. You in this moment, stretched out under your own blanket, may feel far removed from that world. You have doors, walls, maybe even air conditioning. But still, there's something comforting in knowing that even centuries ago, in the cold and crowded corners of history, people still found ways to whisper to each other, to reach for a hand in the dark, and to share the warmth of being near. Not just lovers, but humans trying. The rooster crows not as a metaphor, but as a very real and very loud alarm clock. It's early, painfully so, and light hasn't yet seeped through the cracks in the wooden shutters. You roll over on your straw-filled mattress, aching slightly from a night spent on uneven boards and bundled wool. But as you shift, so does the memory of something else, the tangle of affection attempted under a shared blanket, the tension of timing, and the whisper of retreat at the sound of stirring children. And now, with the sun not yet risen, your thoughts drift towards something stranger. Still the long list of days when love wasn't just inconvenient, it was forbidden. In the medieval world, passion had a schedule, and that schedule was kept not by hearts or moods or moonlit moments, but by the church. It's hard to overstate how thoroughly the church shaped private life during the Middle Ages. It didn't merely preach from the pulpit on Sundays. It regulated the rhythms of marriage reproduction, and yes, physical intimacy. With the same fervor, it applied to doctrine and confession. According to canon law and countless ecclesiastical manuals, intimacy between married couples was permitted, but only within strict boundaries. Anything outside those lines wasn't just frowned upon, it was sinful. Let's start with timing. Sunday. Absolutely not. That was the Lord's day reserved for prayer and rest. Friday. Also, no, it was a day of penance. Wednesday, suspicious. You were supposed to be spiritually preparing for Sunday. Add in Lent 40 full days plus Advent another 40. Then toss in major feast days, saints' days, fast days, holy days of obligation, and the odd prohibition tied to lunar phases. Suddenly what's left is a patchwork of maybe dates, floating inside a sea of holy nope. Historian John Boswell once joked that the church calendar left so few acceptable days for intimacy that medieval couples must have scheduled lovemaking like tax accountants. The sentiment was humorous, but not far from the truth. One real 13th century confession manual explicitly lists over 100 days per year when intercourse was not allowed, including specific Tuesdays and moon eclipses. Some priests even warned against intimacy during thunderstorms, fearing it might be a sign of the devil's presence. Imagine trying to build intimacy in a world where lightning flashes outside and someone mutters, "Best not tonight." It's Saint Apollonia's vigil. Of course, this begs the question, how seriously did people take it all? That's a difficult question and one that divides scholars. Some suggest the rules were widely known but loosely enforced, especially in rural parishes, where clergy were fewer and less strict. Others believe these regulations were deeply internalized, especially by women who bore the brunt of moral expectations. Parish records show that some couples did confess to violating these guidelines and were assigned penance fasting, extra prayers, or public acts of humility. What's clear, however, is that these rules gave the church a kind of power that reached directly into the bedroom. If your priest could dictate when you were allowed to show affection to your spouse, what did that say about your freedom, about the boundary between faith and flesh? This wasn't lost on medieval thinkers. Some monastic writers praise celibacy, not just as holy, but as a kind of spiritual clarity, a way to rise above earthly concerns. Others, like Thomas Aquinas, viewed marital intimacy as necessary for reproduction, but dangerous if pursued for pleasure. It was, as he delicately put it, a means with an end, but not an end in itself. Yet the human experience refused to be fully contained. A quirky example comes from a 14th century French peasant diary, where a man named Piers recounted how he and his wife tried to plan around the church's forbidden days, but lost track of the feast calendar, and in his words accidentally celebrated a saint's vigil with more passion than prayer. His priest later forgave them with a mild admonishment and 3 days of fasting. The story, light-hearted as it is, reveals something important people tried. They tried to follow the rules, and sometimes they failed. And when they failed, consequences varied. In some towns, public penance could be demanded. A couple might have to walk barefoot through the square wearing simple robes and ashes. In others, especially small rural communities, such matters were quietly forgiven, so long as no scandal followed. But shame, that silent weight, often did the work more effectively than any formal punishment. A raised eyebrow, a whispered comment during Mass, a small change in how the neighbors shared their bread. Intimacy wasn't just private, it was communal. Even the physical spaces of worship reflected this. In certain churches, carvings known as moral panels were displayed near the pewswood, or stone reliefs depicting various sins and their consequences. Among these were suggestive images meant to warn against lust. One church in Sweden has a panel showing a couple attempting to embrace, only to be pecked at by demon-headed birds. Whether literal or allegorical, the message was clear: the body could not be trusted. And yet, it was all so human. The same priests who warned against indulgence also blessed marriages. The same churches that punished unwed passion also presided over baptisms, weddings, and prayers for fertility. Even within the rigidity of doctrine, there was an underlying acknowledgement that people would inevitably seek each other out. Some scholars suggest this contradiction was intentional. By creating a system filled with frequent prohibitions, the church ensured that guilt remained an ever-present companion, and with guilt came confession, and with confession came the church's enduring relevance. Whether or not it was designed that way, the result was a kind of intimate surveillance, where couples carried not just their desires, but a mental checklist of date saints and liturgical seasons. So imagine this: you're a cobbler's wife in a small English village. It's late summer. The wheat is high, the harvest is near. You and your husband finally find a quiet night after weeks of fatigue. But it's Friday. You hesitate. You know what the priest said. But you also know that the sky is soft, the air is warm, and something in your chest says this moment matters. What do you do? That tension between rule and feeling between devotion and desire was not just a footnote of medieval life. It was its heartbeat. And sometimes that heartbeat whispered not tonight, but other times it whispered now. The fire is out. The bread is rising and outside the shutters. Morning light spills across a quiet path, worn smooth by generations of bare feet. You sit at the edge of your low bed, wrapping coarse wool around your shoulders, and glance toward the heavy wooden chest by the wall, the one that held your mother's bridal linens, and now holds your own. You think of her wedding, of her quiet resignation. You think of yours. Because in the medieval world, love wasn't part of the contract. Marriage, for most people, noble or not, wasn't about romance. It was about land, security, livestock, inheritance, reputation, and of course, alliances. Whether those alliances connected kingdoms or neighbors, their success was measured not in affection, but in strategic advantage. Among the nobility, marriage was a matter of diplomacy. Kings didn't marry queens, they married treaties. A duke might offer his daughter in exchange for military support. A count might secure his position by marrying the niece of a powerful bishop. The bride and groom themselves often met for the first time during the wedding ceremony, or shortly before, while the ink was still drying on the dowry contract. And no one asked them how they felt about it. There's a medieval proverb recorded in a 14th century French manuscript that goes, "Better a rich match with a crooked nose than a poor one with a pretty face." Practical, yes, but not exactly heartwarming. Even among peasants where status and power weren't quite so weighty, practicality still reigned. A woman might consider a man's oxen before his smile. A man might ask about a woman's grain store before her laughter. According to rural courtship customs recorded in parts of England and Germany, many couples were arranged by parents or negotiated through local elders. The question wasn't, do you love him? But can he plow a straight line? Still, not all was so dry. In some communities, there were traditions designed to allow young people a measure of choice. Festivals, dances, and shared workdays that provided opportunities to observe and flirt, albeit discreetly. In the Low Countries, for example, springtime courting windows allowed girls to sit in view of the street, while eligible bachelors strolled by. These quiet rituals offered just enough space to nurture a spark, without setting the village ablaze. Yet for many, marriage was a duty, and affection, if it bloomed at all, came later, much later, sometimes never. One poignant account comes from a 15th century English woman named Marjorie, who married a carpenter chosen by her family. In her spiritual autobiography, she writes, "He came to me with kindness, but I did not know him. I feared the touch more than the hammer's ring, for at least the hammer gave warning. Over time, she grew to respect him, perhaps even love him, but not before enduring years of silence between them." Some historians debate whether this emotional distance was viewed as a problem. Scholar Barbara A. Hannawalt notes that medieval society placed a higher value on order than intimacy. A quiet household where duties were fulfilled and children were raised was more admirable than one filled with affection but instability. The goal wasn't love, it was legacy. And yet longing found its way in through cracks in the system. Consider the role of poetry. Courtly love literature, flourishing in noble courts from the 12th to the 15th century, didn't celebrate marriage. It romanticized unattainable love, often love for someone already married, someone above one's station, someone who could never be yours. The pain of desiring the forbidden became its own kind of devotion. Knights sang for queens. Squires wrote verses for ladies they would never touch. These weren't acts of rebellion against the system, they were part of it, contained safely in metaphor and music. But every metaphor has its mirror. For each chaste poem written to a duchess, there was a stolen glance between a stable boy and a kitchen maid. For every noble serenade under a balcony, there was a peasant who lingered just a moment too long at the well, hoping for a smile. These moments weren't officially sanctioned, but they were real. And sometimes they grew into something more, though often in secret, and often against the odds. Because even when two people married for love, or learned to love within marriage, they were rarely alone in it. The household was crowded. Servants came and went. Family slept nearby. And yet affection persisted. There are surviving letters, rare but radiant, that capture this private tenderness. One 14th century miller wrote to his wife while traveling, "The river is not as wide as my missing you. I carry your scarf in my pocket, and each night I pray it will smell still of you. It's not Shakespeare, but it's something better. It's real." Of course, the opposite was just as common. Marriages built on duty often soured. Women could be mistreated, especially in households where power was skewed heavily toward the husband. The law offered little recourse. A man could legally chastise his wife within vague and undefined limits. Some towns kept complaint registers, early versions of domestic reports, but action was rare unless death or scandal followed. And yet not all imbalance led to cruelty. Many couples developed mutual respect, shared jokes, even companionship. Some lived side by side like business partners, raising children, managing fields, budgeting bread and meat, and found peace in rhythm. It wasn't romantic, but it was functional. Some scholars argue that this functionality itself was a kind of love, or at least its foundation. In a world where survival was a shared task, a reliable partner was more precious than a poetic one. Still, stories emerge, especially in ballads of couples who broke the mold, who chose each other despite family objection, who married for laughter instead of land. They were rare, perhaps, but not impossible. And their stories suggest that even within rigid expectations, some hearts refused to follow the script. And what about those who never married widows' monks? Women who remained in their parents' homes, men who joined guilds instead of households. Their lives were filled with other forms of connection. Brotherhood, sisterhood, friendship. Some of these relationships held deep emotional intimacy, even if they never turned romantic. And in that, perhaps they were freer than most. So here you sit, watching the sun warm the stone path outside your door. You think of your partner. Not a soulmate, perhaps. Not a grand romance. But someone who shares your burdens, knows your silences, laughs at your worst jokes. And in a world where nothing is guaranteed, not crops, not health, not tomorrow, that's something. It may not be love as the troubadours sang it, but it's real. And in the end, that's what holds. The air is still. Outside, a thin breeze pushes smoke through the chimney, and the soft clatter of hooves echoes in the distance. Inside, you tighten the laces of your bodice, not out of vanity, but necessity. The cloth is scratchy, the stays are stiff, and the air is damp with the scent of iron and bread. You glance toward the corner of the room where a folded linen sheet sits neatly on a wooden chest. Clean, untouched, waiting, because tonight you're getting married. Or rather, you're already married. The feast is over, the guests have drifted into song or sleep. And now comes the part everyone knows about, though no one discusses directly. Except they do. And they will. And that sheet in the corner, that's not just fabric. It's proof. It's evidence. It's your testimony, whether you like it or not. This was the reality for many medieval brides. The bloody bedsheet tradition. A ritual as cultural as it was biological. In some parts of Europe, particularly in regions of France, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe, it was customary to display the bridal sheet after the wedding night, stained ideally with virgin blood, to assure the families and communities that the bride had indeed entered marriage pure. In certain towns, it was hung from a window or paraded through the village like a banner. In others, the families would examine it behind closed doors, nodding gravely, silently, with the weight of generations behind their gaze. This practice, while not universal, is well documented. According to historian Daniel Jacquard court records from 14th century Paris reference disputes, where lack of proof on the wedding night led to annulments, family feuds, and even legal proceedings. The sheet became more than linen, it became verdict. And therein lies the danger of myth. Because virginity, as we now know with absolute medical certainty, cannot be proven or disproven by bleeding. The hymen is not a seal. It varies greatly between individuals and can be stretched or torn from non-sexual activities. And yet in medieval society, where honor lineage and female virtue were so tightly bound, the bedsheet told a story that could not be questioned, or if questioned carried consequences. Women bore this burden silently. Some prayed they would bleed. Others, desperate and terrified, smeared drops of animal blood on the fabric to mimic the expected outcome. A few brave souls tried to resist the tradition altogether, only to face suspicion, shame, or worse. The expectation wasn't just physical, it was cultural, psychological, binding. And what of the men? They faced no such test. Male virginity was at best a curiosity, at worst a joke. A man's experience was neither proven nor required. In fact, certain medieval texts, such as the Speculum Regale, a 13th century Norwegian instructional manual, advised young men to gain worldly knowledge before marriage, hinting that a bit of premarital dalliance would settle the nerves. No one examined their sheets. No one questioned their purity. This imbalance created a society in which female bodies were policed by tradition, rumor, and textile, while male bodies moved through the same moments with far less scrutiny. The result was not just a personal inequality, but a public one. Reputation became a commodity, and for women it was fragile. A single whisper, "She didn't bleed," could unravel futures. Some scholars suggest that this intense focus on virginity wasn't merely about morality. It was about property. Marriage, especially among landowning families, wasn't just a union of hearts, it was a transaction. And if a woman wasn't intact, there were fears she might be carrying another man's child, which could disrupt inheritance lines. In that context, virginity wasn't a virtue, it was a warranty. But even outside the elite class, the pressure was real. In rural communities, a bride's reputation reflected on her entire family. Fathers, brothers, and uncles were judged by the honor of their women. Mothers were blamed for raising her loose. Girls were warned from early ages. Don't be alone with boys, don't walk out at dusk. Don't let your smile linger too long. It wasn't just about action. It was about appearance. One 15th century sermon from Flanders warned, "A maiden's virtue is like glass. Once cracked, even if repaired, all see the flaw." And so silence became survival. Few women spoke openly about their wedding nights. Fewer still told the truth. Most simply endured, prayed, hoped, and woke up the next morning with a bruise in their chest that had nothing to do with touch. And yet they found ways to resist, to endure. In certain regions, women formed tight female networks, sisters, cousins, friends who quietly passed on herbal wisdom to ease pain or prepare the body. In some villages, midwives would coach young brides ahead of time, offering gentle advice or herbal tinctures to simulate bleeding. The goal wasn't deceit, it was protection. There's a haunting letter from a 14th century German woman preserved in the archives of Lübeck, where she writes to her sister, "I felt fear not of the man, but of the morning. I feared the sheet, the eyes, the silence. You were right, the vinegar helped." That line, so small, so whispered, contains centuries of truth. Some historians debate how widespread or rigid these traditions truly were. Others suggest they were more symbolic than literal, a gesture, a social signal, rather than a biological test. But even symbols can wound. Even expectations can scar. And the myths didn't end with the sheet. The chastity belt, that infamous iron contraption supposedly locked around a woman's waist to prevent sexual contact, was likely a Renaissance fabrication, exaggerated in later centuries and popularized by Victorian collectors obsessed with moral control. No solid evidence exists for its widespread use in the Middle Ages. Museums have displayed them. Yes, but many are 19th century replicas or outright hoaxes. Yet the image persists, doesn't it? A woman bound in iron, watched by her husband, treated as property. It fits the narrative we've inherited. But the truth is more subtle, more human, and in some ways more tragic. Because real control didn't require chains. It required shame, social enforcement, and the quiet complicity of tradition. So tonight you glance once more at the folded linen. You breathe in. You remember that your body does not need to prove itself. But centuries ago, someone just like you did not have that luxury. She lay still in a room that was not hers, under expectations she did not write, hoping the fabric beneath her would satisfy a world that never asked how she felt. And perhaps if you listen closely, you can still hear her breath, shallow trembling, as dawn crept in through a shuttered window, and someone knocked to ask, "Well, is she worthy?" But you know better. She always was. There's a chill in the air, but the cobbled streets are alive with motion. A woman adjusts her veil just slightly lower. A man pulls his hood tight against the breeze, and the scent of barley smoke, and something else, sweat perhaps, or lavender oil, lingers in the corners of the alley. The doors here are narrow, the windows small, but the candles inside flicker long into the night, because this part of town doesn't sleep early. Welcome to the medieval brothel, legal, visible, taxed, and not nearly as secret as people like to pretend. In the medieval world, sex work wasn't hidden. It was regulated. Contrary to modern assumptions that medieval society was prudish and sexually repressed, many European cities openly tolerated even licensed prostitution. Municipal records from cities like London, Paris, and Florence show that brothels were established with government oversight, often in designated districts near markets, taverns, or riverfronts. These weren't shadowy underground dens. They were businesses, and sometimes they had signs. In Southwark, just across the Thames from the City of London, there was an area famously known as the Stews. The term referred to bathhouses, which evolved into brothels over time. By the late 14th century, they were so organized that official rules were posted, including hours of operation, maximum number of women per house, and even behavior expectations for patrons. The church, ever morally invested, looked the other way, or more accurately preferred to concentrate such sin in one place, where it could be monitored. One of the most fascinating records from this area comes from the 15th century, where a London ordinance dictated that sex workers must not solicit too loudly or cause unrest among decent folk, and that the women must be free from disease, unbeaten, and of proper age. It's a strange sentence, one that reveals both the desire to control and the implicit acknowledgement that these women existed, that they were part of the city's fabric. And they were. The women who worked in brothels came from many backgrounds. Some were widows, others abandoned wives. Some had debts they couldn't repay, or families they had to support. Few entered the trade by true choice, but many found in it a kind of strange stability, even power. Inside a brothel, a woman might earn more in a week than a laundress did in a month. She might send coins home to her sister, or buy herself a cloak lined in fox fur. She might for a moment control the gaze rather than merely endure it. And the clients, everyone, merchants, squires, apprentices, knights, even clergy. A 14th century Florentine account lists patrons by profession, from tailors and cobblers to 2 monks in black robes. Payment came in many forms, coin of course, but also food, firewood, wool, or fresh eggs. In a world where barter was as common as silver, you could trade a bushel of apples for an hour of companionship. It sounds humorous now, and perhaps it was even then, but it underscores a truth: everything had value, even desire. One quirky regulation from the German city of Nuremberg in the 1400s stated that on feast days, brothels had to close at sundown, not for morality, but because too many men were skipping church to spend time in the baths. Enforcement was lax, but the rules still stood etched into the ledger alongside grain prices and sewer repairs. Still, brothels weren't places of romance. The interactions were transactional, rehearsed, and often layered in performance. Women used cosmetics made of crushed herbs and animal fats. They dyed their hair with saffron or lime to appear more fashionable. They were trained to speak gently, to pretend interest, to offer not love, but the illusion of it. In some houses, women were given lessons in etiquette, or taught how to read enough to recite lines of poetry. A few brothels even employed musicians. Yet beneath the painted faces and powdered wigs, these women lived difficult lives. Many suffered disease. There were no antibiotics. Syphilis, likely arriving in Europe in the late 15th century, spread quickly. Some brothels had house physicians who dispensed herbal treatments, wormwood vinegar washes, or mercury ointments. But these were often ineffective, even dangerous. Punishment loomed for stepping outside the system. A sex worker found plying her trade in unauthorized zones could be beaten, fined, or imprisoned. In some cities, repeat offenders had their heads shaved in public, a branding of shame. And when women aged or grew ill, or could no longer perform, few options remained. A lucky few retired to convents. Most did not. And yet even here in the unlikeliest of places you find nuance. Some women formed close bonds with each other. Sisterhoods forged not by blood, but by survival. In bathhouse quarters in France, records describe shared meals, pooled earnings, and even informal unions, women living together, long after their working years selling herbs, mending linens, or reading fortunes. There were also rare, flickering moments of tenderness. A 15th century love poem found in the margins of a Roman brothel ledger, likely scribbled by a clerk or patron, reads, "She laughed and the room turned warm. I paid my coin and stayed for silence." Whether this was affection, loneliness, or simply poetry is unclear, but it reminds us that no space is wholly empty of feeling. Historians still debate how society truly viewed sex workers in the Middle Ages. Were they condemned as sinners, tolerated as necessities, or pitied as victims? The answer is yes and no, and it depends. Attitudes varied by region, class, and culture. The same priest who denounced women of the stew from the pulpit might have visited them after dusk. The same city that regulated their wages might have refused them burial in consecrated ground. This duality, this paradox, was the norm. Public secret, necessary shame, familiar stranger. So you walk past the flickering doorways now, the wooden signs that creak in the wind, the laughter that rises and falls like waves against stone. You don't stop. Not tonight. But you glance just for a second and wonder about the women inside, about their stories, their choices, their survival. And as you turn the corner, the wind lifts a scrap of parchment near your feet. You catch it curious. It's a list services prices rules. You fold it quietly and place it in your pocket, not for scandal, but remembrance. Because history isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's just honest. Night has fallen again, but the stars are shy tonight, veiled behind clouds that move like secrets across the sky. Somewhere in the hedgerow, an owl calls. A soft wind bends the tall grass, and in a low-roofed cottage nestled near the edge of the village, a woman leans over a wooden table lit by a single oil lamp. She's grinding something, leaves maybe, or seeds, into a fine powder. Beside her is a cup of warmed wine, and in the air, thick with the scent of herbs, floats a question that's as old as humanity. How do you love without consequence? Because while the church might have focused on when married couples could engage in intimacy and social customs, might have obsessed over virginity and reputation, the people themselves were grappling with something far more immediate. how to love without bringing a child into a world not ready for one. And so they turned to what they had, the earth, the moon, each other, and centuries of whispered advice. Birth control in medieval Europe was a blend of trial tradition, folklore, and medicine. And while it wasn't reliable by modern standards, that doesn't mean it was ignorant. In fact, records show that medieval people were very much aware of fertility and sought to influence it in a number of creative, sometimes surprising ways. Let's begin with herbs. The most commonly cited was pennyroyal, a minty plant that grows wild in parts of Europe. It was dried, steeped, and sipped often in wine as a folk remedy believed to delay the womb's fruit. Other plants used for similar purposes included rue tansy mugwort and wild carrot seeds. These herbs were passed down from woman to woman, often through midwives or elder healers, known as wise women. In the Trotula, a medieval medical compendium written in Salerno during the 11th to 12th centuries, there are recipes for both contraceptive and abortifacient treatments, some involving herbal pessaries, others involving potions meant to cool the womb. The Trotula was widely read and referenced by physicians across Europe, suggesting that even in scholarly circles, the question of reproductive control was acknowledged if quietly. Of course, the Church did not approve. Canon law largely condemned contraception as a form of defiance against divine order. A woman who avoided pregnancy was seen in some corners as rejecting her natural role. And yet in practice, many priests turned a blind eye, especially in rural areas where doctrine yielded to local custom. Still, discretion was essential. Most women brewed their teas or crushed their herbs in private, or sought the help of midwives who operated just outside formal medicine. These midwives were not only birth attendants, they were herbalists, counselors, even spiritual guides. One 14th century midwife in northern Italy reportedly carried a small pouch of moon-touch seeds that she claimed could close the womb to unwelcome flame. Whether it worked is beside the point. The belief carried comfort, agency, and not all methods were botanical. Some turned to physical practices. Coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method, was known and mentioned in texts, though it wasn't spoken of publicly. Prolonged breastfeeding was used as a natural spacing method, which also had support in church doctrine, as it aligned with maternal virtue. Certain women tracked their cycles based on moon phases or bodily signs, even if their understanding of ovulation was imprecise. There were more unusual methods too. In parts of Eastern Europe, a woman might bury a small animal bone near the doorway of her home, believing it would trap unwanted seed. Others wore amulets, small leather pouches filled with ashes feathers, or inscribed prayers around their necks or hips. A record from 15th century Prague mentions women tying knots in a red ribbon once for each day they did not wish to conceive. Some of these methods border on the mystical, but they speak to a deeper truth. Control over reproduction wasn't just a biological concern, it was spiritual, symbolic, existential. One quirky detail comes from a 13th century French folktale in which a woman attempts to prevent pregnancy by standing on one leg after intercourse and reciting the names of 3 rivers backwards. It sounds absurd, and it probably was, but even here in humor lies a kind of hopeful desperation. People wanted options. They wanted choice. And perhaps more poignantly, they wanted time. Because not every couple was ready for children. Some struggled with poverty. Others had already lost little ones to fever or famine. Many feared childbirth itself, and rightly so. Maternal mortality was high. One medieval Englishwoman in a letter to her sister wrote, "The midwife says I am strong, but I feel the door to heaven too close. If I must enter it, tell them I walked through with love in my hands." Historians today debate the actual efficacy of medieval contraception. Some scholars argue that many of the herbal methods were ineffective or even dangerous. Others point out that some of the substances used, particularly Queen Anne's lace seeds, wild carrot, do have documented post-coital contraceptive effects, even if medieval users didn't understand the mechanisms. The truth likely lies somewhere in between imperfect knowledge paired with powerful intention. The most powerful tool, however, may have been knowledge shared between women. In cultures where male physicians dominated formal medicine, it was the women's sphere, the kitchen, the garden, the birthing chamber, where the real strategies were whispered, guarded, and passed along. These were not the realms of books or scrolls, but of tea leaves, dried bundles, and knowing glances. In some ways, it was a parallel science hidden in plain sight. There is tenderness in that secrecy, a quiet bravery. So tonight, as you sit beneath a low ceiling and stir something into your clay cup, something bitter maybe or sharp on the tongue, you remember that your choices are few, but they are yours. You watch the moon rise through the window, waxing slowly, lighting the rim of the clouds. You place a hand on your belly, not in fear, but in respect. This body, this moment, this knowledge, it is your inheritance. Not perfect, not always safe, but powerful nonetheless. Because even in a world that tried to script your future, you still found a way to write your own line with mint leaves, with river prayers, with ash-filled pouches, and sisterly advice, not to erase the possibility of life, but to choose when and how to welcome it. The harvest moon hangs low tonight, swollen, pale, watchful. Its light drapes over the village green where tomorrow there will be laughter dancing and bread dipped in honey. But tonight there's tension beneath the hush. A door creaks. A dog barks once, then goes quiet. And just beyond the hedge, two figures stand too close their breath, mingling in the cool air. A touch lingers too long. A promise is exchanged. And somewhere unnoticed but very real, someone else is watching. Because in the medieval world, even love had witnesses. And sometimes those witnesses went straight to the authorities. Premarital intimacy was risky, not just emotionally, but legally, for all the practical challenges surrounding privacy and control. One thing remained clear: if a couple was caught being physically involved before marriage, there could be serious consequences. Fines, public shaming, or an enforced wedding with little room for joy. It wasn't just about morality. It was about order, and ensuring that reproduction happened within a framework the church and community could control. In many parts of Europe, ecclesiastical courts handled such matters with an astonishing level of detail. These weren't back-alley rumors. They were formal hearings often sparked by local gossip, a jealous rival, or even a concerned family member. In England, for example, the court records of the Diocese of York during the 14th and 15th centuries contain hundreds of cases of fornication, pre-contract, and sexual misconduct brought against villagers. These documents are filled with witness testimony, personal details, and verdicts. The church wanted these behaviors recorded and corrected. One such case dated 1392 involved a couple named Alice and Robert, accused of lying together carnally before marriage. Their neighbor, a woman named Joan, testified that she had heard noises unbecoming to Christian modesty and had seen the boy leaving at dawn with hay in his hair. The couple admitted to the act but claimed they intended to marry. The court fined them $1 each and instructed them to wed before the month was out. They did. This kind of outcome was common. In fact, one of the quirks of medieval canon law was the concept of sponsalia per verba de praesenti, a form of verbal marriage contract where a man and woman declared themselves married in the present tense, followed by consummation. According to church law, that was legally binding. No priest required, no witnesses necessary, just two people, a few key words, and a physical union. Of course, this led to complications. Couples could and did exploit this loophole, declaring themselves wed in private, then hoping the village priest would accept it later. Others used it sincerely, especially if their families disapproved, or if the union was urgent. But the church, trying to regain control, began to require bans, public announcements of impending marriage, and more formal ceremonies. Still, when intimacy occurred without these conditions, and when it became public knowledge, the punishments varied. In some cases, the church issued light penance extra prayers, a short fast, or public confession. In others, fines were levied. The amount often depended on the couple's wealth and whether pregnancy occurred. A first-time offense might be overlooked. A second, not likely. And if the couple refused to marry afterward, they could be excommunicated, cut off from the church, the sacraments, and their community. But here's the twist. If the couple did marry afterward, the sin was often wiped clean. It was a sort of spiritual backspace key. Yes, we sinned, but we made it right. This approach wasn't necessarily hypocritical. It reflected the church's larger concern: legitimacy. Once married, the children were legitimate. Property rights were preserved. Inheritance was secure. And so, over time, a strange dynamic emerged. Couples would be caught, brought before the bishop, fined, and then married quickly, sometimes within days. It was discipline, yes, but it was also efficiency. Of course, this system gave rise to another figure, the snitch, sometimes called informers or moral witnesses. These were individuals, often neighbors, midwives, or even family members, who reported illicit relationships to the church. Some did it out of genuine religious concern, others for spite, and some for reward. In a few regions, informers received a portion of the fine paid by the guilty couple. That's right, medieval tattling had commissions. In one memorable case from the Ecclesiastical Court of Norwich in 1478, a woman named Margaret reported her own cousin for having lain with Thomas the tanner thrice in the barn behind St. Elric's. When asked how she knew this, she replied that she had seen shoes left outside the door and heard whispering close and low. Whether this was piety or pettiness remains unclear, but it worked. Her cousin was fined and forced to do public penance. And what of the weddings that followed? They were often hasty, quiet, lacking in celebration, sometimes held at dawn to avoid scandal. But they were real, and many of them endured. Some couples thrust into marriage by law and shame found connection over time. Others lived lives of bitter tolerance. A few perhaps looked back and laughed, because love in the Middle Ages didn't always begin with a poem or a vow. Sometimes it began with a fine. Some historians have argued that this system, as harsh as it seems, actually offered certain protections. It acknowledged intimacy as part of life, not merely sin. It provided a path to legitimacy. And in a world where reputations were fragile and options limited, even a forced wedding could become a second chance. Still, the fear lingered. For many, it was not the act itself, but the discovery that frightened most. Being seen, being named, being judged. So you picture it now, a young couple beneath the hayloft beams, fingers laced, breath held ears, straining for footsteps. They're not reckless. They're not sinful. They're just human. And in the moment, they believe they're alone. They're not. Not really. But they risk it anyway, not because they defy the world, but because for a few trembling seconds they forget it. And sometimes that forgetting is what makes it all worth remembering. The bell tower tolls in the distance, each chime drifting over fields and stone walls like a sigh. It's late, but not everyone sleeps. Candlelight flickers behind narrow windows. A page turns in silence. A quill scratches something private. And somewhere behind thick monastery walls, two novices pass each other in the cloister, walk a brief glance, a silent pause, then parting like ships in fog. Because even within the most pious corners of medieval life, the heart had its own strange hunger. In monasteries and convents where chastity was vowed, and physical desire renounced, another kind of intimacy took root, deep emotional bonds, forged not in rebellion, but in proximity duty and long, quiet hours. And while some of these relationships were platonic spiritual and anchored in mutual devotion, others weren't so easy to define. In a world that viewed sexuality in stark binary terms, moral or sinful, holy or carnal, What happened when deep affection bloomed in spaces meant for celibacy? Historians still debate this question. Some argue that these close ties between monks, between nuns, between spiritual companions were expressions of brotherhood or sisterhood, nothing more. A kind of sacred friendship. A shared love for Christ reflected through care for one another. But others point to writings, letters, and poems that hint at something else, something richer, more complex, and sometimes quietly romantic. Take, for instance, the preserved correspondence between 12th century nun Hildegard of Bingen and her younger companion Richardis. Hildegard, a visionary and theologian, wrote passionate letters begging Richardis not to leave the convent. She described her grief as a wound. "You are my heart's companion. Your absence is like a limb torn from my soul." Some scholars read this as emotional exaggeration. Others see evidence of spiritual intimacy, and a few wonder if it was something more, or consider the monastic practice of spiritual friendship, a concept encouraged by theologians like Elred of Rievaulx, who wrote in the 12th century, "Friend cleaves to friend in the spirit of Christ." But love warms, and that warmth can soften even the most disciplined heart. His descriptions of ideal companionship between monks, filled with longing devotion and mutual admiration, toe a delicate line. They are beautiful, they are intense, and they are open to interpretation. Inside the cloister, monks and nuns lived in tight quarters. They woke, prayed, ate, and slept according to strict schedules. Silence was often enforced, but connection was inevitable through shared labor, mutual study, or simply the comfort of another soul enduring the same long nights. It wasn't only same-gender affection that raised eyebrows. Convents often corresponded with nearby monasteries, exchanging letters, gifts, even poetry. In some cases, monks served as confessors to nuns, guiding their spiritual development. This created intimate pastoral relationships, where power, emotion, and theology intertwined. One unusual 14th century letter from a monk to a nun preserved in the archives of Mainz reads, "I see your soul in every psalm I recite. I know your hands in every page I turn. May God forgive my weakness." Whether this was a fleeting feeling or a deeper attachment, we'll never fully know. But its tenderness is undeniable. Of course, the Church recognized this potential for blurred boundaries. Many monastic rules, from the rule of Saint Benedict onward, included strict instructions to limit private conversations, avoid extended eye contact, and sleep in open dormitories to discourage temptation. The goal was not just celibacy in action, but purity in thought. Still, desire does not vanish simply because it's forbidden. In fact, sometimes it sharpens in shadow. That's not to say all emotional bonds were romantic or sexual. Far from it. For many monks and nuns, these friendships were anchors, sources of comfort in a life stripped of family autonomy and physical affection. In the absence of children or spouses, a fellow brother or sister could become the person you leaned on most. Love, in its purest, gentlest form, found a way to exist even within walls built to exclude it. And sometimes that love looked like poetry. Medieval devotional literature is filled with verses that could be read as both sacred and personal. Lines that speak of yearning ecstasy, divine embrace. Were these metaphors for spiritual union? Most likely. But they also illustrate how emotional language, especially around love, was deeply woven into religious life. One curious example is the phenomenon of mystical marriages, where nuns describe their visions of being spiritually wed to Christ. In these accounts, the language becomes intensely physical kisses, touch even the consummation of union. Some historians view this as symbolic theology. Others suggest it reflects suppressed desire channeled into divine metaphor. Regardless of interpretation, what's clear is this: the boundaries between spiritual and emotional intimacy in the cloister were porous, sometimes blurred by devotion, sometimes by loneliness, and sometimes by something unspoken. And what about discipline? Yes, there were scandals. Records exist of monks and nuns who broke their vows, who were discovered in trysts fled the cloister to marry, or were punished for carnal temptations. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. For most restraint held, not because desire didn't exist, but because love was redefined, made quiet, made distant, made sacred. Still traces remain. A pressed flower between 2 pages of a monastic prayer book, a scribbled note in the margins of a psalter, a pair of initials carved into the underside of a bench. These are not grand gestures, but in a world of vows and veils they meant everything. So tonight you walk the stone halls in silence, bare feet brushing cool flagstones, candlelight guiding your path. You pass a fellow novice, and your eyes meet just briefly. Nothing is said, nothing is broken, but in that flicker something gentle passes between you. Not sin, not scandal, just recognition. And in the quiet you understand, even in the holiest places, hearts are still hearts. The courtyard is quiet at dusk. Stone walls tinged with gold ivy curling around the edges of the latticework, like it's trying to overhear secrets. A lute plays softly in the great hall, plucking out a melody, half learned, half lost. And you newly arrived in your Lord's service stand at the edge of the corridor watching her walk by. You bow, of course. She doesn't look at you, but her sleeve brushes your shoulder just lightly, and for a moment the world goes quiet. This is not the beginning of a romance. Not exactly. It's something else, older, stranger, far more painful. It's courtly love. In medieval Europe, especially among the nobility, courtly love wasn't about marriage. In fact, it often very specifically wasn't. It was about longing, endless, exquisite longing for someone you could not have. A noble lady, a married knight, a queen, a rival's wife. The forbidden nature of the love was the point. Pain was the proof of its purity. In literature, this ideal was everywhere. Troubadours sang it in the courts of Aquitaine. Poets etched it into manuscripts from Toulouse to Tuscany. Chivalric romances revolved around it from Tristan and Isolde to Lancelot and Guinevere. These weren't stories of domestic bliss. They were tales of impossible passion of knights, wounded not by sword but by sigh. But these weren't just stories. Courtly love was a cultural script, a performance, and often a real emotional dynamic, played out in noble courts. A young man might devote himself to a lady of higher status. He might write her verses, carry her colors into battle, even pledge his loyalty to her above his own wife. And she in turn might encourage him with glances, with riddles, with delicate tokens like a handkerchief or a ring. It was all very formal, very coded, and utterly saturated in tension. According to scholar C.S., Lewis, courtly love developed in a time when marriage, especially among nobles, was arranged entirely for political reasons. In such a world, passionate love had no legitimate outlet. So it found expression through artificial distance, admiration from afar service without reward, love without consummation. It was idealized suffering, and people embraced it. Letters survive from the 12th and 13th centuries that read more like laments than declarations. One knight wrote, "She passed me in the hall and my heart died. I pray she never knows what she does to me, for I am not worthy to speak her name." Another said simply, "I dream of her shadow." Not her, just the place where she once stood. Was this love? Or was it performance? Historians debate that, and they should. Because courtly love was both deeply emotional and highly stylized. There were even rules, yes, actual documented rules, recorded by Andreas Capellanus in his 12th century treatise De Amore. These rules included such gems as marriage is no excuse for not loving, and a true lover is always trembling. But make no mistake, people took this seriously. In some noble courts, entire rituals existed around this idea. Love courts would be held where noblewomen presided as judges over cases of romantic complaint. Was a lady's coldness justified? Was a knight's devotion sincere? These were debates with real social implications, even if they seem absurd now. And yet behind the ritual, there was real emotion, because courtly love, for all its performative flourishes, offered people something they often didn't get in their arranged marriage's choice. Even if that choice ended in suffering, even if it never went anywhere, it gave people the thrill of possibility, the intimacy of secret admiration, the ache of connection withheld. And sometimes, rarely but meaningfully, these unfulfilled relationships spilled over into reality. Affairs happened. Affairs that broke vows, shattered reputations, and changed the course of history. The affair between Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court poet, Bernard de Ventadorn, inspired generations of verse. The tragic love between Abelard and Eloise, though shaped more by intellectual partnership than courtly ritual, still echoes through time, their letters preserved as testaments to passion denied. But for most, these longings remained dreams. A knight polishing his lady's horse's bridle, just for the chance to touch something she touched. A servant girl pinning a flower where she knew her lord would see it. A merchant's son composing a poem he'd never dare to deliver. These quiet acts, romantic and restrained, were a kind of resistance against a world where love was supposed to be practical, where emotions were inconvenient, and where hearts had no say in futures. There's a quirky historical detail from a 13th century Italian court in Padua, where men would compete in verse duels exchanging love poems for an unseen lady, each trying to outdo the other in devotion, wit, or heartbreak. The winner received nothing but admiration. The lady in most cases was a fiction, but still the emotion was real, because longing does not require a recipient to be valid, only a witness. And sometimes that witness is the self. So tonight you find yourself writing. Not a letter, not exactly, but something shaped like one. A few lines scratched onto a piece of parchment you'll never send. You write of her walk, her voice, the way she holds her hands when she listens. You fold it carefully. You do not sign your name, because that's not the point. The point is the ache. The point is the waiting. And somewhere in a great hall just beyond your reach, she listens to the same lute you do, and does not know that you love her. And maybe that's what love is sometimes. Not possession, not promise, just presence, unspoken, unseen, but felt. The flicker of torchlight plays across the stone floor. A nobleman walks beside his bride, newly veiled and silent, her head bowed just slightly as the doors close behind them. Their guests return to the feast. The priest has spoken. The vows are done. And yet, as the night presses on and the household grows quiet, something heavy remains not in the air but in the silence between them. Because in the medieval world, consent was not what you think it was. Today we define consent as mutual enthusiastic and clearly expressed agreement. It's emotional, verbal, grounded in personal agency. But in the Middle Ages, consent was legal, contractual, and often silent. It was less about desire and more about structure, about who approved and who mattered. Let's start with the Church. By the 12th century, canon law established a crucial principle. A marriage was valid if both parties consented in present tense and were free to marry. This was a progressive step, theoretically protecting individuals from being forced into marriage against their will. A couple could declare, "I take you as my spouse," and if they followed it with consummation, their union was binding, priest or no priest. But here's the problem in practice, that consent was often presumed manipulated or hidden behind social pressure. Young girls, sometimes as young as 12, were legally old enough to marry under church law. Boys could marry at 14. While most marriages happened later for peasants among the nobility, these early unions were tools of alliance. Families arranged them. Fathers negotiated them. Mothers prepared their daughters not for affection, but for duty. And what of the bride's opinion? It depended. In some cases, daughters resisted and were punished. Chronicles from the Burgundian court describe one noblewoman who attempted to flee a marriage she didn't agree to. She was captured, forced to marry, and later wrote, "They said, I nodded, but I only breathed." Did that count as consent? According to the law at the time, yes. One mainstream historical fact comes from the work of historian James Brundage, who details how the Church increasingly emphasized consent in marriage by the 13th century, yet still failed to define how that consent should be expressed or verified. There were cases of consent under duress being deemed valid, especially if consummation followed. If a woman protested before marriage but acquiesced later, even silently her earlier resistance could be dismissed. This ambiguity opened the door for coercion to hide behind compliance. A girl who didn't cry out, a woman who didn't run, a silence mistaken for agreement. And in a world where a woman's body was often seen as an extension of her family's honor, silence was safer than shame. Even within marriage, consent was not consistently required. According to prevailing legal norms, a husband had the marital right to his wife's body. Theologians and jurists debated the issue, of course. Some argued that spouses owed each other mutual respect and kindness. Others insisted that a wife could not refuse her husband without sin unless during fasting illness or church-prohibited days. Rape within marriage was not a legally recognized concept. The body once wed was no longer entirely one's own. There are accounts, painful ones, of women seeking annulment, not because they were unloved, but because they were overwhelmed, exhausted, fearful. In 1311, a woman named Agnes petitioned for separation from her husband, claiming he used cruel force nightly. The court denied her. Her marriage was valid, they said. Her suffering was not enough. And still some women resisted. A 15th century woman in Lubeck locked herself in a monastery to escape her betrothed, declaring she would rather live as a servant of God than a wife to a man she did not choose. Her family tried to drag her out. The abbess refused. In rare moments, the church stood with the woman. But these were exceptions, not rules. Even in peasant communities, where marriage often included some degree of familiarity or affection, the idea of enthusiastic consent was blurry. A couple might sleep together first and declare themselves married after. A woman might go along with a match because she had no other option, or because the consequences of saying no were too severe. Economic dependency was a powerful silencer, and then there were the moments no one spoke of. A girl at a festival, too much ale, a corner too dark, a boy who didn't listen or didn't care. What happened then? If her parents knew, they might insist the boy marry her to restore her honor. The church might bless the union. And she might spend a lifetime carrying the weight of a night that was never hers to choose. It wasn't just physical force that complicated consent. It was structure. The entire society was shaped to make certain outcomes seem inevitable. You agreed because you had to. You accepted because resistance was dangerous. And if you didn't say no clearly enough, you'd be told later that you'd said yes. Still within this system, voices rose. The poet Christine de Pizan, one of the earliest known female writers in Europe, wrote in the 15th century that true love could not exist without mutual will. She criticized men who boasted of conquest and mocked those who dismissed a woman's choice. She wrote, "Love without consent is theft, not gift." Her words radical then still echo now. Today we look back and struggle to reconcile these truths. On the one hand, the medieval church recognized consent as essential to valid marriage. That fact matters. It placed some power, at least on paper, in the hands of individuals. On the other hand, societal norms, legal ambiguities, and deeply entrenched hierarchies diluted that power until it often vanished. Consent became a technicality, not a truth. So you imagine yourself standing in a simple dress, hands folded, a ring being slipped onto your finger. Your heart is pounding. You glance at the priest, at your parents, at the man before you. And when he says the words, "With this ring, I thee wed," you nod. Because saying nothing would be scandal. because saying no would be ruin, because saying yes was expected, and years later you might forget the color of the candles, the sound of the bells. But you will not forget that moment, that pause, that breath, where your silence was mistaken for surrender, and your body, once yours, became part of the contract. The candles flicker low, casting halos of gold along the wooden beams above you. You lie still, wrapped in scratchy wool and shadows, aware of every creak in the floorboards. Outside, the wind sighs through the trees. Inside, silence stretches thick, expectant, uncertain. You wonder not for the first time if tonight is allowed, because in the medieval world, the church didn't just preach from pulpits. It followed you into the bedroom. Medieval Christianity wasn't content with public morality. It reached behind closed curtains and into your most private moments. What you did, how you did it, when, and even why, all were subject to spiritual scrutiny. And though medieval peasants were no strangers to bending rules, those rules still loomed carved into sermons whispered in confession and etched onto the calendar. Let's start with a truth that surprises many. The church did not forbid sex entirely. On the contrary, it recognized it as a necessary part of human life, especially for marriage. St. Augustine himself acknowledged that reproduction was a divine purpose. But pleasure, that was more complicated. According to Augustine and later theologians like Thomas Aquinas, physical intimacy was not inherently sinful, but the intention mattered enormously. If your motive was love and procreation, you were safe. But if pleasure became the primary goal, if desire overtook duty that veered dangerously close to sin, as historian Pierre J. Payer notes in his study, sex and the penitentials to enjoy too much was to risk your soul. And so the church created a taxonomy of intimacy, a system of do's and don'ts that could rival a modern user manual, except much more judgmental. Missionary position. Acceptable barely. Anything else. Questionable. Excessive enthusiasm. Suspicious. Frequency to be monitored. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval penitentials' handbooks for confessors outline specific penalties for improper sexual acts, even between married couples. These guides, like the 10th century penitential of Burchard of Worms, offered a chilling amount of detail. A couple confessing to intimacy during daylight for pleasure alone might be assigned a week of fasting. Doing so on a Sunday or feast day, longer penance. And during Lent, don't even think about it. The calendar, in fact, was a spiritual minefield. Over 100 days each year were marked as inappropriate for intimacy, including all Sundays, holy feast days, the 40 days of Lent Advent, the eve of major saint celebrations, and even certain phases of the moon, depending on local superstition. By the time you subtracted everything a married couple might find, they had fewer than half the nights of the year left for closeness, and even then under strict guidelines. It's no wonder that many medieval people confessed not out of guilt, but confusion. Did I sin last night? A man might ask his priest. Was it Wednesday? Yes. Then yes. You sinned. It sounds absurd today, but these rules were real and in many communities enforced. Priests had the power to deny sacraments to those in sexual sin. Public penance was not unheard of. And confession itself became a delicate ritual, as husbands and wives tried to remember what was allowed and what was too joyful. Of course, people didn't always comply. A 13th century English priest, writing in frustration, complained that the peasantry takes to bed as to bread without heed of the holy. But even when ignored, the rules cast a long shadow. They created an atmosphere of shame and anxiety that lingered even in private. One of the most quirky and obscure details from this period comes from a 12th century monastic manual that warned monks to avoid laying too near to walls, as the proximity to married couples might tempt the mind to unclean imagination. Yes, even hearing your neighbors could be considered spiritually risky. But perhaps the most sobering aspect of all this is what the Church didn't say. There were no guidelines for tenderness, no rules about mutual affection, safety, or emotional connection. The focus was on structure, not sensitivity. A husband could demand intimacy from his wife without asking if she was ready, and the Church would support him as long as he wasn't too loud, too creative, or too cheerful. Historians still debate whether medieval clergy truly believed in enforcing these rules among lay people, or whether the stricter guidelines were mostly intended for monks, nuns, and the clergy themselves. Some scholars argue that these texts were aspirational, idealized visions of purity that few actually followed. Others point to court records and ecclesiastical trials where people were punished for transgressing sexual norms. In one case, a baker's wife in 14th century France was fined after admitting to having relations on a Friday with a laughter. The court record noted the irreverent mood as aggravating the offense. Another man was punished for dancing before the act, which the judge interpreted as prideful preparation. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the attitude. And yet, among all the restrictions, there were flickers of humanity. A letter from a rural priest in Bohemia to his bishop includes a quiet plea: "Let us not burden them too much. Their days are long and the nights are their only comfort." It's a rare acknowledgement that love, even under scrutiny, still needed room to breathe. So you imagine yourself curled beneath blankets after a long day of toil. The world outside is silent. The fire burns low. You turn to your partner not with guilt, not with shame, but with tired affection. You hold hands in the dark, unsure if tonight is permitted. But still, you hope. Because even in a world ruled by calendars and catechisms, the heart searched for moments of closeness. And sometimes it found them in defiance in silence, or simply between the lines of a prayer. Steam curls upward as you ease your body into the warmth. The marble beneath you hums with heat. Water trickles from a spout shaped like a lion's head, the sound echoing softly through the vaulted space. Around you, voices rise and fall, quiet, deliberate, occasionally teasing. You're not alone. You're in a Roman bathhouse, and though the empire itself fell long ago, its sensual blueprints lingered in the imagination of medieval Europe. To speak of medieval intimacy without detouring through the Roman Empire would be like discussing candlelight without acknowledging the sun. The Romans elevated bathing into a full-bodied ritual part, hygiene part, social theater part, erotic ambiguity. Their bathhouses were public, architecturally exquisite, and at times morally suspect. And though most of them crumbled by the 6th century, their legacy persisted in art memory and the whispered fantasies of later generations. In medieval Europe, bathhouses did exist, though humbler and often viewed with suspicion. In cities like Paris, Cologne, and Prague, they carried the scent of both cedarwood and scandal. Couples visited them together. So did merchants, scribes, and students. You could bathe, gossip, flirt. Sometimes you could even hire company for the evening. But if we travel further back to the height of the Roman Empire, we find a mainstream historical fact. The baths of Caracalla in Rome, completed around 216 CE, could accommodate over 500 bathers at once. Fed by aqueducts and heated by an ingenious system of underground furnaces called hypocausts, these baths were technological marvels and political tools. Because for Roman emperors, public bathing wasn't just about cleanliness. It was performance. Leaders like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius made symbolic visits to public baths to appear accessible and virtuous. The act of bathing beside citizens, though they often retreated to private wings afterward, was meant to cultivate an image of humility and shared experience. Even as they ruled the known world, emperors wrapped themselves in towels just like everyone else. Yet behind the marble and mosaics there was another layer seduction. Some of it subtle, a glance exchanged through steam, a brush of skin in the tepidarium. Some of it transactional. Certain bathhouses functioned as brothels in all but name. There were private rooms, side entrances, codes of conduct. Services could be bartered like spices, sometimes literally. A Roman satirist once joked that a night of company cost 1 fig, 2 compliments, and the promise of a second bath. As the empire crumbled and Christianity rose, many bathhouses fell out of favor, condemned as dens of vice, luxury, or disease. But the architectural memory of these spaces endured. Some medieval bathhouses in Central Europe, especially in Germanic regions, were consciously modeled after Roman designs, featuring vaulted ceilings, warm plunge pools and side chambers for rest, and sometimes whispered arrangements. A quirky, obscure detail survives from 14th century Nuremberg, where city records mention a bath attendant, known only as Hans the Soft-Handed, renowned not for his looks, but for his ability to scrub and soothe the backs of weary knights. It's unclear whether Hans offered more than hygiene, but the moniker alone made him legendary. Bathhouse etiquette in the Middle Ages was complex. In some towns, men and women bathed together at least until church reforms cracked down in the 15th century. In others, hours were gender segregated. Still, rules were often relaxed on feast days or during harvest festivals, when laughter grew louder and glances lingered longer. Historians still debate the role of bathhouses in medieval erotic life. Some argue they were primarily about cleanliness, especially in plague-stricken eras, where hygiene became survival. Others point to evidence of social mingling, clandestine meetings, and coded invitations passed beneath folded towels. In one Bavarian town, a preserved love letter from a washerwoman to a shoemaker reads simply, "I will meet you after the second bell. The water will be warm." Even language carried echoes of Roman sensuality. The Latin phrase balneum amoris, bath of love, appears in troubadour poetry and religious satire alike, often hinting at both spiritual cleansing and carnal curiosity. And in the more lenient corners of the church, some clerics even tolerated co-ed bathing, provided no one laughed too loudly or stayed too late. Of course, not all bathhouses were luxurious. In smaller villages, bathing might mean sitting in a barrel while a neighbor poured warm rainwater over your head. Still, the idea of shared warmth, of letting go of layers, both literal and emotional, persisted. You'd soak scrub sigh. Maybe you'd trade stories. Maybe you'd trade more. One preserved diary from a 15th century Polish merchant describes a moment in the bathhouse as a pause in the spinning wheel of days, when flesh forgets the weight of duty. It's an image that lingers, not because it's erotic in the modern sense, but because it's human. A flicker of relief. A space, however brief, where rules melted like wax in steam. Tonight, as you rest, the idea may still resonate. The heat of the water, the hum of quiet voices, the softness of skin after labor. You may be centuries removed from marble baths and Roman mosaics, but the longing for warmth, touch, and companionship across space, status, or speech remains a very old instinct. Even if you're alone, even if your bath is just a quick rinse in a modern shower, the ancient echo persists. Water as connection, steam as sanctuary, a fleeting moment when the world blurs, and in the haze someone smiles. You sit quietly now, the warmth of the imagined bathhouse fading behind you, and something cooler settling in its place. Not a chill, but a clarity. A sense of air returning to your lungs of the mind, sharpening gently in the dim quiet. In the ancient world, after the indulgence came reflection, and no school of thought captured that more than Stoicism. Now you might not expect a philosophy built by toga-wearing thinkers on a Greek porch to have anything to do with medieval relationships. But you'd be surprised, because underneath all the rules, restrictions, and rituals of medieval intimacy, there was one unspoken virtue that echoed through monastic walls, noble bedrooms, and even the peasant hearth restraint. And the blueprint for that virtue came in part from the Stoics. Stoicism wasn't about cold detachment. At its core, it was about discipline control and moral clarity, learning to ride the storms of desire and fear without being wrecked by them. That meant knowing yourself, recognizing temptation, and responding with purpose rather than impulse. For medieval thinkers, especially those in religious orders or scholarly circles, Stoic values offered an anchor, not unlike the way some people today turn to mindfulness or journaling when emotions get overwhelming. The mainstream historical fact here is that Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, and one of the most famous Stoic philosophers, wrote his private reflections, now known as Meditations, while commanding armies at the edges of a fragile empire. These weren't essays for fame. They were self-checks, reminders to remain steady in power loss, fatigue, and desire. One of his lines, often quoted centuries later by monks and mystics alike, reads, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That mindset traveled. Long after Rome fell, monastic communities across medieval Europe preserved and recopied Stoic writings. They read Seneca alongside scripture, paired Cicero with commentaries on temptation, and sometimes even scrawled Stoic aphorisms in the margins of psalms. A 12th century Benedictine monk named Peter of Cella once wrote, "The inner life of a man must be still as a mountain lake, even when storms rage around him." It sounds Christian, but it's also deeply Stoic. Now let's add a quirky historical detail. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, began his philosophical journey by accident. According to ancient biographies, he shipwrecked off the coast of Athens and wandered into a bookshop where he discovered a volume on Socrates. When he asked the bookseller where he could find someone like that, the man pointed to a shabby figure walking by. That man was Crates, a philosopher, who lived in a barrel and once threw all his money into the sea to prove he wasn't owned by it. Zeno signed up on the spot. From a literal wreck came a philosophy of calm. So how does that apply to medieval intimacy? Imagine a young monk struggling with intrusive thoughts in the silence of a scriptorium, or a noblewoman in a loveless arranged marriage, whispering her frustrations to a confessor who quotes Epictetus instead of offering comfort. Imagine a widowed peasant kneeling in candlelight, trying to sort grief from guilt. In all these moments, Stoicism offered a script. Desire is not evil, but it must be tamed. Pleasure is not the goal, but clarity is. Even secular writers took note. In the courtly love poems of the 13th and 14th centuries, knights often pledged to suffer sweetly and longing to burn with honor, not lust. These weren't just romantic flourishes. They echoed the idea that virtue lies in choosing not to act in staying grounded, despite the pull of the heart. Some scholars argue that this emphasis on restraint shaped the entire architecture of medieval intimacy. Celibacy became the gold standard of holiness. Fasting was not just about food, but about appetite in every form. Monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, were a kind of radical stoicism cloaked in religion. But historians still debate how sincerely these ideals were practiced. Were monks always celibate? Did every knight uphold his vows? Likely not. Some abbeys were famous or infamous for their lax behavior. One 14th century report from a French diocese notes a group of nuns who regularly hosted traveling minstrels for singing and nocturnal merriment. That's one way to interpret Stoic detachment. Still, the aspiration mattered. Even the rules you break shape the world you live in. And the ideal of self-mastery left deep marks not only in personal choices, but in art, architecture, and literature. Medieval sermons quoted Stoics without attribution. Alchemical texts describe purification of the soul through the distillation of base urges. And one popular religious tract referred to the quiet fire of a virtuous life, a phrase borrowed from Seneca himself. Even today, when people try to stay centered, detach from drama, or master their thoughts, they're echoing something ancient. A voice that whispered across centuries, "You do not control the wind, but you can set your sail." So tonight, if you feel overwhelmed by longing, by memory, by the weight of choices, remember, this restraint isn't repression. It's a form of power. Not the loud kind, but the kind that hums quietly in the background, like a candle that doesn't flicker no matter the draft. In a world where emotions often surged like storms, Stoicism taught medieval people, and maybe you too, to breathe, to pause, and to choose the next word carefully. Not to be cold, but to be clear. By now you've journeyed through dim monasteries and noisy hearths, strolled past flickering candlelight, and heard echoes of longing behind stone walls. But what if those same feelings, restraint, desire, self-control, have followed us not just in thought, but in algorithm tonight as you lie still phone, maybe set on night mode? You're not alone in your search for calm. The flickering screen, the gentle narrator's voice, the midnight scroll through quotes and affirmations, these too are rituals. And oddly enough, they're not so far removed from the quiet disciplines of ancient minds. Because Stoicism, that philosophy of restraint, of tempering chaos with clarity, is trending again. Not in the halls of dusty universities, but in the modern temples of distraction, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. The mainstream historical fact is this: Stoicism was not meant to be a lecture series. It was a lifestyle. The ancients called it a praxis, something you practice daily like stretching or cooking. Roman philosophers like Epictetus and later Marcus Aurelius didn't write for applause. They wrote for endurance. And yet, centuries later, their words reappear in millions of social media posts. One of the most shared quotes across self-help circles is this: "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That's Marcus, alive in the pixels of our times. But what brought it back? Some say it was the pandemic, the sudden collective need to find stillness amid uncertainty. Others credit Tim Ferriss, Ryan Holiday, or modern digital Stoics, who revived the old porch wisdom for a generation drowning in dopamine hits. Hashtags like Nana Daily Stoic, Nana Memento Mori, and Amor Fati now sit alongside viral dance challenges. It's a strange marriage ancient thought in modern packaging. And yet it works. There's something comforting about knowing you're not the first person to lie awake, wondering if you're enough, if you're strong enough to let go, if you're brave enough to feel something and still remain steady. The Stoics didn't demand perfection. They simply invited you to reflect, to pause, and to try again. A quirky historical detail that's been making the rounds online lately. In the 3rd century, Stoic philosophers reportedly gathered under porticos, not just to teach, but to people watch. One Greek writer described Zeno as fond of watching the foolishness of the marketplace, not to judge, but to better understand man's comedy. In other words, the Stoics might have scrolled if they had smartphones. They observed. They didn't retreat from society, they studied it, laughed at it, forgave it, just slowly. So what does this mean for intimacy? It means that even as we long stumble and scroll, we're part of a lineage, one that has always tried to balance feeling and thinking. The tension between desire and discipline is not new, nor is the anxiety that comes from trying to do the right thing when your heart says otherwise. Medieval monks wrestled with it. Roman generals wrote about it. And now we meme it. Some scholars debate whether this new digital Stoicism captures the full depth of the original. Is it oversimplified, marketed too slickly? Critics say yes. A tweet is not a treatise. A quote slapped on a sunset background lacks the nuance of lived hardship. But others argue that any re-engagement with wisdom, even imperfect, is better than none. Especially in a world that prizes speed outrage and endless noise. And here's where it all folds back to medieval times. Because that era, for all its darkness, had rhythm. It had pause. The liturgical calendar marked feasts, fasts, and quiet periods. Bells tolled at set intervals. Monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which divided the day into sacred hours, not for productivity, but for presence. The body, the soul, and even desire were not rushed. They were woven into the rhythm of life. In many ways, what we crave now is not just information. It's permission to slow down, to think, to not respond instantly, to feel something and not share it. That is Stoic, and perhaps that is medieval too. Because here you are lying back, letting your breath soften, listening not to an emperor or a monk, but to yourself. Through the gentle echoes of history, you're doing what people have always done, seeking steadiness. One philosopher once wrote, "To be calm is the highest achievement of the self." That line has no known author. It's been attributed to everyone from Zen masters to Marcus Aurelius to anonymous Tumblr posts. But maybe that's the point. Wisdom doesn't need a name, it just needs a place to land. And tonight it's landed here. You're almost at the end of the story now. The firelight has dimmed. The room, once filled with flickers of detail. Goats in the corner candlelit monasteries whispers through curtains, is softer now, wrapped in quiet. And maybe that's fitting. Because this final chapter isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It's a gentle breath, a slow exhale, a look back at everything we've seen, and everything that was never spoken. In medieval times, there was love. Of course there was. But it didn't always announce itself in the ways we expect. It didn't come with flowers or public declarations, not often. It came in moments, fleeting, fragile, half-hidden in silence, in shared glances across dinner tables, in letters that couldn't be signed, in the touch of a sleeve as someone passed by. Because in a world ruled by law ritual, and the ever-watchful eyes of God and gossip love had to find its way through the cracks. The mainstream historical fact is that courtly love, the idea of noble, non-physical poetic longing, became a major literary and cultural theme in the High Middle Ages, especially from the 12th to 14th centuries. Originating in the courts of southern France, it spread through troubadour songs and knightly tales, where desire was never consummated, but idealized. It wasn't about having someone. It was about aching for them beautifully. You can still hear echoes of it today, in every tragic romance, in every slow, sad ballad, in every story where two souls almost touch but don't. But medieval people didn't only live in poems. They lived in messy, real bodies. They loved clumsily under pressure. They made do with what they had. And often they didn't have much. Privacy numbered permission rare. But still they found ways. Here's a quirky historical detail in 15th century Germany. A lover might send their crush a token of affection, not flowers, but a decorated pastry. Yes, baked goods with icing messages long before Valentine's Day cards. One surviving recipe describes a honey sugar cake for discreet affection meant to be eaten in secret. Love, it turns out, was also sweet and edible. And yet even with gestures and glances, so much was left unsaid. The church had rules. The family had expectations. The law had punishments. Love, the kind that didn't fit, had to live in silence. Some historians still debate how much of this silence was repression and how much was self-preservation. Were people truly denied the chance to feel? Or did they simply feel differently under different terms? Did they suffer in silence? Or did they find other languages? Music, poetry, embroidery, prayer. Because love in all its forms has always been clever. It adapts. It finds space. Even in a crowded peasant cottage. Even behind monastery walls. Even between arranged marriages and religious edicts. In many ways, the medieval world was like a stage where everyone played their role. The dutiful daughter, the chaste bride, the pious monk. But behind the curtain, the heart whispered its own lines. And now, as your own eyes begin to close, maybe you understand something about them. About those people who lived so long ago and yet felt so much the same. They longed. They waited. They hoped. They feared being seen and feared not being seen. They wondered, as you might have, if love meant breaking rules or making your own. Somewhere a troubadour sang to a lady who would never reply. Somewhere a monk pressed his palm to a cold stone wall and imagined a face he'd never touch. Somewhere a wife stood in a doorway watching her husband walk away again, hoping next time he'd look back. And somewhere, perhaps not far from where you are, someone else is lying in the dark, wondering if love, the real kind, still survives all the noise. It does. It's in the silence. It's in the space between. So as we close this long, winding journey, let yourself sink into the quiet. You've heard stories of law and longing passion, and punishment, discipline, and desire. You've seen how even in the tightest corners of medieval life, the human heart found room to beat. Now let it rest. Close your eyes. Let the flickers of memory drift like candle smoke. Let the warmth of the past surround you like wool blankets. And let the ache of longing not for someone, but for stillness melt away. Because this is the space between, and you are finally home.